That chair is for a blood descendant, Sarah. Get that brat off the hardwood before she stains the upholstery." My father did not scream the words. He did not have to. His voice was a low, jagged blade that sliced right through the festive carols playing in the background. Before I could even reach out a hand, his palm connected with my daughter's shoulder. It was a sharp, dismissive shove, the kind of movement one might use to brush a nuisance off a sleeve. Lily, only 9 years old and brittle, with the sudden shock of it, went sprawling. Her small frame hit the polished oak floor with a short, hollow thud bone meeting wood. Before I tell you how I burned their entire legacy to the ground that night, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice. Also, drop a comment below letting me know which city you are watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel across the country. The silence that followed was not accidental. It was a practiced, heavy thing. 20 adults sat around a table laden with prime rib and cranberry sauce, their silver forks suspended in mid-air like a frozen portrait of American prestige. My mother, Margaret, adjusted a sprig of holly on the centerpiece, as if she had not just seen her own granddaughter hit the floor. My sister Olivia leaned over to wipe a drop of juice from her own daughter's chin, her eyes darting to the empty chair my father had just cleared. No one spoke. No one moved to help. The only sound in the room was the soft, ragged intake of breath from my daughter as she tried to understand why the man she called Grandpa had just treated her like trash. I crossed the room in 3 steps. The world had gone narrow and white at the edges, a cold clarity settling over me that I had never felt in 24 years of living under Richard Miller's shadow. I knelt on the floor, my knees clicking against the wood, and pulled Lily into my arms. She was shaking her palms, skidding on the floor as she tried to push herself up. Beneath the thin fabric of her white holiday tights, I could already see the bloom of angry red where her skin had scraped the grain. She did not cry. She was already an expert at disappearing, at being small, at apologizing with her body for the crime of taking up space. "I have got you." I whispered into her hair, my voice vibrating with a fury so deep it felt like it was part of my marrow. I helped her to her feet, steadying her as she leaned into my side. She felt so light, so unbearably fragile against the backdrop of this massive, expensive house. Richard was still standing at the head of the table, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt. He looked down at us, not with regret, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a man who believed every one of his actions was a law unto itself. "That place is for family," he said, picking up his wine glass and swirling the dark liquid. "Real family, not some charity case you brought home to spite us." A soft titter of nervous laughter rippled through the aunts and uncles at the far end of the table. It was the sound of people who were relieved the lightning had struck someone else. My mother finally looked up her face, a mask of porcelain perfection. "Hannah." She said, her voice smooth and devoid of heat. "Let us not make a scene. It is Christmas. Just take the girl to the kitchen and get her a plate there. Let us have a nice dinner." I almost laughed. The absurdity of it was the final chord to snap. For years, I had played their game. I had accepted the crumbs of their affection, the backhanded compliments, and the constant reminders that I was somehow less than Olivia. I had listened to the whispers about my mother's past and my father's doubts, letting them use those shadows to keep me humble and grateful for their leftovers. I looked at Olivia, who was now helping her daughter Emma climb into the chair Lily had been shoved out of. Olivia caught my eye and smirked a tiny triumphant twitch of her lips that said, "I win again." I did not go to the kitchen. I did not apologize. I reached into my leather bag, which I had slung over the back of my chair earlier that evening. My fingers closed around the manila folder I had been carrying like a hidden debt for weeks. I walked back to the table, my heels clicking with a deliberate, lethal rhythm. The room went even quieter, if that was possible. Even the children stopped fidgeting. I stood at the head of the table directly opposite my father. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the fine lines of greed around his eyes and the arrogance in the set of his jaw. He was a man who thought he had won because he had the biggest house and the loudest voice. I reached out and placed the folder directly on his gold-rimmed dinner plate, right on top of the expensive cut of meat he had been about to enjoy. The paper absorbed a drop of grease, a dark stain spreading across the official seal. "What is this?" Richard asked, his brow furrowing as he reached for the folder with a hand that had begun to tremble, though he tried to hide it. "Is this a Christmas card, Hannah, or another request for a loan you will never pay back?" I leaned forward, my hands flat on the white linen tablecloth. I made sure every person in that room was watching. I made sure my mother could see the way my knuckles were white. I made sure Olivia saw the end of her reign. "You don't get to touch her," I said, my voice steady and resonant, filling every corner of the vaulted ceiling. "And you don't get to lie to me anymore." Richard flipped the folder open. I watched his eyes scan the first page. I watched the blood drain from his face, leaving him a sallow, sickly gray. He skipped to the second page, then the third. His breathing became shallow, a soft whistling sound in the back of his throat. My mother reached out to touch his arm, her eyes wide with sudden alarm. "Richard." "What is it?" He did not answer her. He could not. He was looking at a court-ordered freeze on his business assets and a formal summons for a full accounting of a $500,000 trust fund that had been missing for over a decade. He was looking at the end of his reputation and the beginning of a prison sentence. I leaned in closer until I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath and the fear beginning to roll off him in waves. I waited until he looked up from the papers, until our eyes locked in a moment of absolute devastating truth. Then I said the 4 words that shattered the Miller legacy forever. "You have been served." My mother's wine glass slipped from her fingers, hitting the table with a sharp clink and sending a tide of red liquid sloshing across the white cloth. It looked like a crime scene. Olivia reached for the folder, but Richard slammed his hand down on it, his fingers clutching the edges so hard the paper tore. "You wouldn't," he hissed, his voice cracking. "You are a child. You have nothing. You are nothing without this family." "I am the one with the paper trail, Dad," I replied, and for the first time in my life, I felt taller than him. "And as of 5 minutes ago, I am the one who owns this table." I turned away from him without waiting for a response. I didn't need to see his rage or my mother's tears. I had spent 24 years waiting for their validation, but in that moment I realized the only thing I ever needed was the truth. I picked up my bag, took Lily's hand in mine, and began to walk toward the foyer. The silence of the dining room broke behind us, erupting into a cacophony of panicked voices, chair legs scraping against wood, and Olivia's shrill demands for an explanation. I didn't look back. I led Lily to the front door, the heavy oak swinging open to reveal a crisp, cold Michigan night. The air was clean biting at my lungs in a way that felt like a baptism. We walked to my old battered sedan, parked at the curb, a sharp contrast to the line of luxury vehicles in the driveway. I buckled Lily into the passenger seat, her small face still pale, but her eyes curious. "Are we going home, Mommy?" she asked softly. "We are going to a new home, Lily," I told her as I started the engine. "And from now on, you sit wherever you want." As I pulled away from the curb, I saw the front door of the mansion fly open. My father stood on the porch, the golden light from the foyer spilling out behind him, making him look like a shadow. He was shouting something, waving the folder in the air, but the glass of my windows was thick and the sound of the heater was a comforting hum. He looked small in the rearview mirror, a tiny, angry man standing in front of a house that no longer belonged to his soul. I drove through the neighborhood, passing house after house with twinkling lights and inflatable Santas on the lawns. For everyone else, it was a night of peace and goodwill. For me, it was the night the war finally went public. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a mixture of terror and triumph that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. I knew what would happen next. I knew the phone calls would start within the hour. I knew the threats would come, the pleas for family unity, the offers of money to make the misunderstanding go away. But they didn't understand. They thought this was about a shove. They thought this was about a chair. They didn't realize that I had been watching the ledgers. I had been watching the way the money moved from the accounts my grandfather had left for me into the legacy properties firm that funded their lifestyle. I had been watching for years as they spent my future to buy their silence. I reached over and squeezed Lily's hand. Her skin was warm now, the shivering having stopped. She looked out the window at the passing lights, a small smile finally tugging at the corners of her mouth. I thought about the manila folder sitting on that greasy plate. Inside were the bank statements I had found in the old roll-top desk, the ones that showed my father had been withdrawing $10,000 a month from my trust since I turned 18. There were the copies of the forged signatures where my mother had mimicked my handwriting to authorize emergency distributions that always seemed to coincide with Olivia's tuition payments or a new kitchen remodel. It was all there. Every lie, every theft, every betrayal documented in black and white. Richard Miller thought he was a king, but he was just a bookkeeper who had run out of time. As we reached the highway, my phone began to buzz in the center console. I didn't have to look at the screen to know it was my mother. I could almost hear her voice, frantic and melodic, telling me that we could fix this, that we didn't need to involve the lawyers, that we were a family above all else. I reached down and switched the phone off. The screen went black, reflecting the passing streetlights. I looked at Lily, who was now humming a quiet tune to herself. She didn't know the specifics of the theft. Ba didn't know about the $500,000 or the forged names. She only knew that for the first time in her life, her mother had stood up and the world had shifted to accommodate us. I drove into the darkness, the headlights cutting a path through the light dusting of snow beginning to fall. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a heavy, grounding resolve. This was only the beginning. The legal battle would be brutal. They would try to drag my name through the mud. They would try to claim I wasn't Richard's biological child to invalidate the trust. And they would try to turn every relative against me. But I had something they didn't. I had the ledger. And I had the truth. The house in the rearview mirror was miles away now, a fading glow in a neighborhood built on secrets. I didn't feel like the 24-year-old girl who had walked into that dinner hoping for a kind word. I felt like a woman who had finally stepped out of a cage I hadn't even realized I was in. We pulled into the parking lot of a small, quiet motel on the edge of town. It wasn't a mansion, and the bedspreads were polyester instead of Egyptian cotton. But as I checked us in, I felt a sense of peace that the Miller estate had never provided. In the room, I sat on the edge of the bed and watched Lily as she climbed into the covers. She looked at me, her eyes heavy with sleep. "Mommy," she whispered. "Yes, baby. I like this Christmas better." "Me too, Lily," I said, kissing her forehead. "Me too." I sat by the window for a long time after she fell asleep, looking out at the empty road. I thought about the first time I had suspected the truth. It wasn't a document or a secret conversation. It was a look my father had given me when I asked for a small loan to help with Lily's medical bills 3 years ago. He had looked at me with a strange flickering fear, a defensive anger that seemed too big for the request. He had told me there was nothing left. He had told me the estate had been settled years ago and that I should be grateful for the roof over my head. That was the day I started looking. That was the day I realized that the paternity doubt he always hung over my head wasn't a source of shame for me, but a shield for him. If he could make me feel like I didn't belong, I would never feel entitled to ask for what was mine. It was a brilliant plan, really, a masterpiece of psychological warfare and financial fraud, and it would have worked forever if he hadn't pushed my daughter. Pride comes before the fall, my grandfather used to say. Richard Miller had plenty of pride, and now he was about to learn everything there was to know about the fall. I opened my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper I had kept for myself. It wasn't a legal document. It was a handwritten note from my grandfather tucked away in the back of the ledger I had found. To Sarah, it read, "You have always been the sharpest of the bunch. Don't let them dull you. Use this well." I folded the paper and tucked it back into my bag. I wasn't the girl they could correct for existing anymore. I wasn't the static in Olivia's perfect reception. I was the storm that was about to wash their world clean. The snow was falling harder now, covering the tracks we had made on the way in. It felt like a fresh start. A cold, hard, beautiful, fresh start. Tomorrow I would call Marcus. Tomorrow the forensic accountants would begin their work in earnest. Tomorrow the world would find out exactly how much it cost to push a 9-year-old girl at Christmas dinner. I laid down beside Lily, her steady breathing the only anchor I needed. My mind was already racing, connecting the dots of the last decade, remembering every budget cut my parents had forced on me while they lived like royalty. I remembered the way my mother would sigh when I needed new shoes, as if my growth was an inconvenience to her lifestyle. It was all so clear now. Every interaction, every holiday, every family meeting had been a performance designed to keep the secret buried. They hadn't been protecting a legacy. They had been protecting a crime. As I closed my eyes, I didn't see the mansion or the silver or the gold-rimmed plates. I saw the look on Richard's face when he realized that the 4 words I spoke were just the opening statement. The neon sign of the motel flickered outside our window, casting rhythmic pulses of pale blue light across the ceiling. Lily was finally asleep, her breath hitching occasionally in her dreams, a lingering echo of the afternoon's trauma. I sat in the single plastic chair by the window, the silence of the room pressing against my ears. My phone lay on the nightstand, dark and silent, now that I had cut the connection, but I could still feel it vibrating in my mind. Every few minutes, my skin would prickle with the phantom sensation of another incoming text or a missed call from a number I had known since I was a child. I reached into my bag and pulled out the ledger I had rescued from the darkness of my grandfather's attic 3 weeks ago. The leather was cracked and smelled of old cedar and cedarwood, a scent that always reminded me of the one person who had actually seen me. My grandfather Arthur had been a man of few words, but he had possessed eyes that saw through the elaborate theater my parents performed daily. 3 weeks ago, I had been tasked with clearing out his old home office, a job my mother and Olivia had refused because the dust was too thick and the memories too boring. I remembered the heavy heat of the attic, the way the sunlight filtered through the grime of the small windows, illuminating millions of dancing dust motes. I had been about to toss a stack of old property tax records when I noticed the roll-top desk in the corner. It was a beautiful piece of mahogany, scarred by years of use, but still dignified. I had been running my fingers along the interior drawers when I felt a slight misalignment in the back panel of the bottom left compartment. It was a classic hidden space, the kind of thing Arthur would have loved. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was the ledger and a thick stack of bank statements from the First National Bank of Chicago. I sat on the dusty floor that day, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against my ribs as I opened the first statement. It was a trust account established 20 years ago with an initial deposit of $500,000. The beneficiary name was printed in bold, uncompromising black ink, Sarah Margaret Miller. I remembered staring at my own name for what felt like an eternity. $500,000 to a girl who had spent the last 3 years balancing her life on a razor's edge, working 2 jobs just to afford a $20 grocery budget for the week. That number was astronomical. It was a fortune. It was a life. But as I flipped through the statements, the shock turned into a cold, paralyzing fury. The withdrawals began the month after my 18th birthday. $10,000 here, $15,000 there. Every single transaction was marked as a trustee distribution. I looked at the signatures on the authorization slips tucked between the pages. My father's handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, aggressive, and slanted to the right. But it was the second signature that broke something inside me. Beside my father's name was the elegant, looping cursive of my mother, Margaret. She hadn't just stood by while he took it. She had held the pen. I remembered sitting in that attic, the air suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. I thought about the time Lily had a fever of 104 degrees, and I didn't have the $40 copay for the urgent care clinic. I had called my mother crying, begging for a small loan just until my next paycheck. She had sighed into the phone, her voice dripping with practiced pity as she told me that things were tight, that my father's investments were down, and that perhaps, if I had made better choices in life, I wouldn't be in such a position. That same month, according to the ledger, they had withdrawn $25,000 for a summer trip to the Amalfi Coast with Olivia and her family. I turned the pages, my eyes blurring as the numbers began to tell the real story of my life. My grandfather had intended for me to be free. He had seen the way Richard looked at me, the way he used the doubt of my paternity, like a leash, to keep me from ever feeling worthy of the Miller name. Arthur had known that the only way I would ever truly be safe was if I had my own ground to stand on. And my parents had stolen that ground inch by inch, dollar by dollar, to fund a lifestyle they couldn't afford on their own. The most disgusting part was the pattern. Every time I had gotten close to finishing my degree or moving into a better neighborhood, a new crisis would emerge. My father would sit me down and talk about the family legacy, about how we all had to sacrifice for the greater good of the Miller reputation. He would remind me that since I was only a Miller by grace and not necessarily by blood, I should be the first one to step back and let Olivia have the opportunities. I realized then that the paternity doubt was the greatest investment my father ever made. It cost him nothing to plant that seed of shame in my mind, and it yielded him $500,000 in return. I spent the next 2 weeks living a double life. I worked my shifts at the diner I picked Lily up from school, and I played the role of the dutiful, struggling daughter. But in the quiet hours of the night, I was meeting with Marcus. Marcus was a man I had found through a legal aid clinic, a sharp-eyed attorney who specialized in fiduciary fraud. He had looked at the ledger and the statements for less than 5 minutes before he leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "Sarah, this isn't just a family dispute," he had told me, his voice low and serious. "This is a massive breach of trust. These are felony-level actions. Your father was the primary trustee, and your mother was the co-signer. They had a legal duty to protect these assets for you not to use them as a personal slush fund for your sister's lifestyle." He had explained the mechanics of the theft. My father had funneled the money through his firm Legacy Properties under the guise of management fees and investment losses. It was a paper trail designed to be boring, a maze of shell accounts and forged signatures that no one was ever supposed to look at. I asked him about the signatures. I showed him a copy of a withdrawal slip for $30,000 that bore my name. "I didn't sign this," I whispered. Marcus had pulled out a magnifying glass, comparing the signature to a copy of my driver's license. "It is a good forgery," he noted, "but look at the way the letter S hooks at the top. That is your mother's flourish. She wasn't just co-signing, she was impersonating you to the bank." The realization had felt like a physical blow to the stomach. My mother, the woman who had tucked me in and told me that she would always protect me from my father's temper, had been the one forging my name to steal my future. We had spent the days leading up to Christmas preparing the petition. Marcus wanted to file quietly to serve them in January after the holidays. But as the weeks went by and I watched my father treat Lily with increasing disdain, my patience evaporated. I saw the way he looked at her at the mall when we ran into them, as if she were a stain on his perfect family picture. I heard the way Olivia talked about her real daughter's private school tuition, knowing full well that my daughter's education fund was currently sitting in the driveway of Olivia's house in the form of a $60,000 luxury SUV. The shove at dinner was just the catalyst. It was the moment the mask slipped so far that even the most delusional person in the room couldn't ignore it. I looked at the blue light of the motel sign again, my mind returning to the present. I reached over and picked up my phone, turning it back on just to see the damage. The screen lit up with 68 missed calls and over 100 text messages. Most were from my mother. "Hannah, please answer. We can fix this. Your father is in a terrible state. Think of the family. You are destroying everything over a little misunderstanding." There were several from Olivia. "You are an ungrateful brat. How dare you do this to Dad on Christmas? Do you have any idea what you have started? You will never see a dime from this family again." And then there was the one from my father. It was the only one that didn't sound frantic. It was cold. It was a single sentence sent an hour ago. "You have made a mistake you will not live long enough to regret." I stared at the words, a chill creeping down my spine. Richard Miller wasn't a man who made idle threats. He was a man who believed he owned the world, and I had just taken away his crown. I thought about the house back in the suburbs. Right now, I knew exactly what was happening. My father would be in his study, pacing the floor, his face purple with rage as he barked orders at his own attorneys. My mother would be in the kitchen, pouring a glass of expensive wine with shaking hands, trying to figure out which of her friends had already heard the news. Olivia would be on the phone, crying to anyone who would listen about how I had ruined her daughter's Christmas with my unhinged behavior. They would be planning their counterattack. They would try to say the ledger was a fake. They would try to say I had stolen it and altered the records. They would lean into the paternity issue harder than ever, trying to convince a judge that since I wasn't a real Miller, the trust was invalid from the start. But Marcus had already prepared for that. He had explained that in the state of Michigan, the law was very clear about trust beneficiaries. If the document named me, my biological connection to the trustee was irrelevant. Richard had accepted the role of guardian over those funds, and by doing so, he had bound himself to a standard of honesty that he had never bothered to practice. I looked over at Lily. She shifted in her sleep, her small hand clutching the edge of the scratchy motel blanket. I thought about the way she had apologized with her body after hitting the floor. 9 years old, and she already knew that her safety was conditional. She already knew that in the Miller house, her presence was a privilege that could be revoked at any second. I realized that I wasn't just fighting for $500,000. I was fighting for the 10-year-old version of myself who had been told she was lucky to have a seat at the dinner table. I was fighting for every time I had been made to feel like a guest in my own family. The money was just the tool. The real prize was the truth. I got up from the chair and walked over to the small desk in the corner of the motel room. I pulled out a piece of motel stationery and a pen. I didn't want to talk to them, but I knew I had to set the tone for what was coming. I wrote a single note addressed to my mother. I knew she would be the one to check the mail, the one to try to bridge the gap before the lawyers took over completely. "Mom," I wrote, the pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. "You told me there was nothing left. You told me Arthur forgot about me. You signed your name to my life and sold it piece by piece. Do not call me again. From now on, you can talk to the court about the legacy you built on my back." I folded the paper and tucked it into an envelope. I would mail it tomorrow morning on the way to Marcus's office. I went back to the window and watched the road. A few cars passed by, their tires hissing on the wet pavement. I wondered if my father had sent someone to look for us. I wondered if he was arrogant enough to think he could find me and talk me out of it, or if he was already transitioning into the scorched earth policy he used in his business dealings. Richard Miller didn't lose. He didn't settle. He crushed his opponents until there was nothing left to fight back. He had done it to small business owners, to former partners, and even to his own siblings years ago. He thought I was just a girl. He had successfully broken a minor nuisance he could shove aside like he had pushed Lily. He didn't realize that I had spent my entire life studying him. I knew his moves before he made them. I knew that his greatest weakness was his vanity. He couldn't stand to be seen as anything less than the pillar of the community. He couldn't stand the idea of people knowing that his legacy properties was built on the stolen inheritance of a 24-year-old girl. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window. The blue light of the sign was still flickering a steady mechanical heartbeat. Tomorrow the legal battle would begin. Tomorrow the bank records would be subpoenaed. Tomorrow the forensic accountants would start digging into the legacy properties books, and the true extent of the fraud would come to light. I knew it wouldn't be easy. My parents would fight with every dollar they had left. They would lie, they would manipulate, and they would try to break me one last time. But as I looked at Lily, I knew they had already lost. Because for the first time in 24 years, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was the one who had turned on the lights. My phone buzzed again on the nightstand, a new message. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. It was from an unknown number, just a series of photos. I opened the message and felt my stomach drop into my shoes. The first photo was of my motel room door from the outside. The second photo was of my car in the parking lot, the license plate clearly visible. The third photo was a picture of me taken through the window of the motel room just moments ago, sitting in the blue light of the sign. There was no text. There was no threat. There didn't need to be. I stood up slowly, my heart racing, and backed away from the window. I went to the door and checked the deadbolt, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the metal. I checked the chain, then pushed the heavy dresser in front of the door with a grunt of effort. Lily stirred but didn't wake. I went back to the bed and sat down, clutching the ledger to my chest. My father wasn't waiting for the lawyers. He was already here. He was trying to show me that there was nowhere I could go where he couldn't reach me. He wanted me to feel that old familiar weight of his control. I looked at the phone again. The unknown number was calling. I let it ring and ring and ring. I wouldn't pick up. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of hearing the fear in my voice. I sat in the dark, the blue light still pulsing outside, and realized that the war wouldn't be fought just in a courtroom. It was being fought right here in the middle of the night in a motel room that was supposed to be a sanctuary. I reached under the pillow and found the small pocket knife I kept for protection. I opened the blade, the silver steel catching the blue light. I wasn't the girl from the dinner table anymore. I was a mother protecting her cub, and if Richard Miller thought a few photos were going to make me crawl back to him, he had forgotten who had actually inherited Arthur's iron will. I watched the door. I watched the window. I waited for the sun to rise, knowing that every minute that passed brought me closer to the moment I would finally see him in front of a judge. The phone stopped ringing. A few seconds later, a final text arrived from the same unknown number. "Go to sleep, Sarah. We will see you in the morning." I didn't go to sleep. I stayed awake listening to the sounds of the motel, the hum of the vending machine down the hall, the distant sound of the highway, the creak of the building as it settled into the cold. I thought about the $500,000. It felt like a heavy golden weight, a prize that was currently being used to buy the very person who was stalking me. I wondered how much my father had paid the person who took those photos. I wondered if it was one of his employees from Legacy Properties, or if he had hired a professional. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was desperate. A man who is winning doesn't send threatening photos in the middle of the night. A man who is winning waits for his day in court. Richard was panicking. He was trying to rattle me because he knew that once the discovery process started, he was finished. He knew that I had the one thing he couldn't buy: the truth. I looked at the ledger one last time before slipping it back into my bag. The numbers were still there, immovable and unforgiving. $10,000, $15,000, $500,000. As the first hint of gray light began to bleed into the sky, I knew the night was over. I had survived the first move in his game of intimidation. I stood up and began to pack our things, moving quietly so as not to wake Lily. We couldn't stay here. We needed somewhere more secure, somewhere with cameras and security guards, and people who wouldn't look the other way when a 9-year-old girl was pushed. I woke Lily gently, her eyes blinking open with confusion. "Time to go, baby," I whispered. "Are we going to Grandpa's?" She asked, her voice small and hopeful. "No, Lily. We are going to see Marcus. We are going to finish this." We left the motel through the back entrance, avoiding the parking lot where I knew someone might still be watching. I drove through the winding back roads of the county, doubling back and making turns that made no sense to anyone following us. By the time we reached the city, the sun was fully up, a pale, cold orb hanging over the skyscrapers. I pulled into the secure parking garage of Marcus's building, the gate closing behind us with a heavy, satisfying thud. I walked into the lobby, clutching Lily's hand and my bag, and headed for the elevators. When the doors opened on the 12th floor, Marcus was already standing there, his face grim as he looked at his own phone. "Sarah, I was just about to call you," he said, ushering us into his private office. "What happened?" I asked, my voice tight. "Your father just filed an emergency motion," he said, dropping a stack of papers onto his desk. "He is asking for an immediate injunction to stop the trust accounting, and he is filing for temporary custody of Lily, claiming you are an unfit mother who has kidnapped her during a mental health crisis." The words felt like a physical blow to my chest, stealing the oxygen from the room. I felt the walls of Marcus's office closing and the mahogany bookshelves and leather-bound laws suddenly feeling like the bars of a cage. I looked down at Lily, who was busy coloring on a pad of paper Marcus had given her, unaware that her entire world was being auctioned off by the man she once called Grandpa. "Unfit!" I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of terror and white-hot rage. He pushed her, Marcus. He shoved a 9-year-old girl onto a hardwood floor in front of 20 witnesses, and he thinks he can call me unfit. Marcus walked around his desk and placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Sarah, listen to me. This is a classic Richard Miller move. It is scorched earth litigation. He knows he cannot win the financial battle on the merits, so he is trying to destroy the messenger. If he can get you declared unstable, he can discredit your testimony and potentially regain control over your affairs. It is a desperate play, but it is a dangerous one." He led me to a chair, and I sank into it, my legs feeling like they were made of water. I thought about the photos on my phone, the blue light of the motel, the feeling of being hunted through the night. I realized then that the person following me wasn't just a threat to my safety. They were a witness for my father's lies. They were documenting a mother on the run, ignoring the fact that I was running from a predator. "We need to move fast," Marcus said, his voice regaining its professional edge. "I have already filed a counter motion for an emergency protective order based on the physical altercation at Christmas. Did anyone record it?" In a room full of 20 people, someone had to have a phone out. I thought back to the dinner. The table had been a sea of luxury, and several of the younger cousins had been filming their plates for social media. I remembered my cousin Taylor sitting near the end of the table. She had been live streaming the dinner to her followers just moments before the shove. I called Taylor right there from the office. Her voice was shaky when she picked up. "Sarah." "Oh my God, everyone is talking. Uncle Richard is telling everyone you had a breakdown and that Lily isn't safe. He says you are trying to extort him for $500,000. "Taylor," I said, trying to keep my voice from breaking. "Were you recording when he pushed her?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I was. I caught the whole thing. But Sarah, my dad told me to delete it. He said if I got involved, Richard would pull his investment from our family business. He is terrified. "Taylor, please," I begged. "He is trying to take my daughter. He is telling a judge that I am the one hurting her. If you have that video, you are the only one who can prove the truth." I heard a soft sob on the other end of the line. 10 minutes later, a file appeared in my inbox. Marcus and I watched it together. The video was crystal clear. It showed the opulent table, the laughter, and then the sudden violent movement of my father's arm. You could hear the thud of Lily hitting the floor and the chilling words about a blood descendant. But the most damning part was the silence of the room, the way 20 adults watched a child suffer and did nothing. "This is gold," Marcus said, his eyes narrowing. "This doesn't just stop the custody filing, it justifies the protective order, and it proves your father is a liar." But the battle was only beginning. 2 days later, we stood in a sterile, brightly lit courtroom for the emergency hearing. The air smelled of floor wax and old paper. My father sat at the opposite table, flanked by 3 high-priced attorneys in charcoal suits. He looked every bit the pillar of the community, calm, composed, and tragically concerned. My mother sat behind him, her face hidden behind oversized designer sunglasses, her hands clutching a silk scarf. Olivia was there too, sitting in the front row of the gallery. She glared at me, her eyes filled with a venomous spite that I finally understood. She wasn't just defending our parents. She was defending the bank account that funded her life. If I won, her new kitchen and her luxury SUV would be the first things on the chopping block. My father's lead attorney, a man with a voice like gravel, stood up and began his opening statement. "Your Honor, we are here today out of a sense of profound tragedy. Richard and Margaret Miller have spent 24 years providing for a daughter who has struggled with deep-seated resentment and emotional instability. On Christmas night, Sarah Miller suffered a public breakdown, took her daughter, and disappeared into the night. We are asking for temporary custody to ensure the child's safety while the mother receives the professional help she so clearly needs. He spoke about my history of erratic behavior, citing the fact that I had moved 3 times in 2 years and held multiple jobs. He ignored the fact that I moved because I couldn't afford rent and worked multiple jobs because my father had stolen my inheritance. The judge, a man with white hair and eyes that seemed to see through every lie, looked over at Marcus. "Mr. Marcus, what is your response?" Marcus stood up with a deliberate slowness. "Your Honor, my client didn't disappear because of a mental health crisis. She fled because she was being physically and financially abused by the very man who now claims to be a protector." He played the video. The courtroom was silent as the sound of Lily's body hitting the hardwood filled the room. I watched the judge's expression. He didn't flinch, but his jaw set in a hard line. When the video ended, Marcus didn't sit down. "Your Honor, we also have the preliminary report from a forensic handwriting expert." He walked to the bench and handed the judge a thick folder. "We have identified over 40 forged signatures on trust account withdrawal slips totaling $380,000. These signatures were not made by Sarah Miller. According to our expert, they were made by her mother, Margaret Miller, acting under the direction of the trustee, Richard Miller." My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. My father's face went from calm to a dark, bruised purple. He turned and hissed something to his lawyer, his composure finally cracking. The judge looked at the report for a long time. Then he looked at my father. "Mr. Miller, do you have a response to the allegation that you used a child's trust fund to pay for your other daughter's property?" My father's attorney jumped up. "Your Honor, this is a complex family financial matter that should be handled in civil court. It has no bearing on the immediate safety of the child." On the contrary, the judge said, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "It has everything to do with the credibility of the petitioner. You are asking this court to grant custody to a man who is caught on film assaulting the child and is now accused of systemic financial fraud against the mother." The judge turned his gaze to me. I felt a sudden sharp spike of anxiety. I was only 24 years old, standing in a cheap suit from a thrift store, fighting against a man who had built a city. The judge spoke. "I am denying the emergency motion for custody. In fact, I am issuing a temporary restraining order against Richard Miller. He is to have no contact with Sarah Miller or her daughter until a full investigation is completed. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate independent audit of all trust accounts and business interests related to legacy properties." The relief that washed over me was so intense I thought I might faint. I felt Marcus grip my arm, a silent gesture of victory. But as we walked out of the courtroom, my father intercepted us in the hallway. The bailiffs were nearby, so he didn't move toward me, but his voice was a low, venomous crawl. "You think you have won, Sarah. All you have done is ensure that you will never be a Miller again. We have already filed the motion for a paternity test. When the court sees that you are not my biological daughter, every cent of that trust will revert to me. You will be left with nothing but a debt you can never pay." I stopped and looked at him. For the first time in my life, I didn't see a giant. I saw a scared, aging thief clutching at the tatters of a lie. "Then keep the money, Dad," I said, my voice clear and loud enough for the passing lawyers to hear. "If the price of being your daughter is $500,000, I will gladly pay it to never have to see your face again." We walked away, leaving him standing in the middle of the hallway, a man who had spent 40 years building a legacy that was now crumbling into dust. Over the next 2 weeks, the audit turned into a criminal investigation. Marcus had been right. The paper trail was a disaster. Once the court-appointed auditors got inside the books of legacy properties, they found a hornet's nest of illegal activity. My father hadn't just been stealing from me. He had been shuffling money between accounts to hide tax liabilities and pay off personal debts. He had treated the trust fund like a high-interest credit card with no limit. Every time he needed to make a payment on his country club membership or buy Olivia a new piece of jewelry, he would simply forge my name and distribute the funds to himself. But the paternity weapon was still hanging over us. Marcus called me into his office on a Tuesday morning. Sarah, they are pushing the paternity issue. The judge is hesitant to dismiss it because your father's attorneys have produced an old medical record from 1998 that suggests your mother had an affair around the time of your conception. I felt the old shame trying to bubble up, but I pushed it down. I don't care, Marcus. Even if he isn't my father, he was the trustee. He had a duty. He does, Marcus agreed. But if we can prove he is the father, it adds a layer of malice to the fraud that will result in triple damages and potential jail time for him. It turns a financial crime into an act of profound predatory betrayal. He pulled a small box out of his desk. I want you to take the test. Not for him, for us. For the court. We need to close every door he tries to open. I took the box and went home. That night, after Lily was in bed, I sat at the kitchen table of our new, secure apartment. I looked at the swab and the vial. I thought about the 24 years of being told I was a mystery, a charity case, a question mark. I realized that my father didn't doubt my paternity because of a medical record or an affair. He doubted it because it was the only way he could justify the way he treated me. If I wasn't his, he didn't have to love me. If I wasn't his, he could steal from me without guilt. I took the test. 10 days later, Marcus called me. Sarah, come in. The results are back. I drove to his office with my heart in my throat. I walked past the receptionist and into his room. He was holding a single sheet of paper, and for the first time since I had met him, Marcus was smiling. It is a match, Sarah, 99.9%. He is your biological father. I sat down, a strange, hollow laughter echoing in my chest. He knew Marcus. All those years he knew he was my father, and he still treated me like a stranger so he could rob me. But that wasn't the biggest news. Marcus leaned forward, his expression turning deadly serious. Sarah, the auditors found something else. They found a second account, one we didn't know about. A second account, I asked, confused. It turns out your grandfather didn't just leave you $500,000. He left a matching account for Olivia, but your father didn't steal from hers. He invested it. Olivia's account is now worth over $1 million, and the records show that she has been receiving dividends from your stolen money for the last 5 years. My sister, the one who had smirked as my daughter hit the floor, had been a knowing recipient of the theft. She wasn't just a spoiled bystander, she was a partner in the crime. Marcus handed me a new set of papers. We are amending the suit. We are going after Olivia's assets as well. We are going after the house, the cars, and every penny she took from you. I felt a sudden cold resolve. I had spent my life being small so they could feel big. I had been the shadow so Olivia could be the light. But the light was about to go out. The final hearing was set for the following month. The paternity defense had blown up in my father's face, and the auditors were now preparing a referral to the district attorney's office for criminal fraud. But my father had one last move. On the night before the hearing, my mother appeared at my door. She didn't look like the woman from the Christmas table. She looked old. Her hair was unkempt and her eyes were red-rimmed. "Hannah, please," she sobbed as I opened the door just a crack. "You have to stop this. Your father is going to lose the firm. They are going to take the house. We will be homeless. You should have thought about that when you were forging my name to buy Olivia's SUV. I said, my voice like ice. It was his idea, she cried. He told me it was the only way to keep the family together. He told me you wouldn't mind that you were always the strong one, that you didn't need the money as much as Olivia did. The strong one. The one who was expected to suffer so the weak could be comfortable. I am strong enough to see this through to the end, Mom, I told her. You chose him. You chose his lies over your own daughter. Now you get to choose which one of you goes to jail first. I closed the door on her, the sound of her weeping muffled by the heavy wood. I walked back into the living room where Lily was playing with her dolls. She looked up at me and smiled. Are we going to win, Mommy? She asked. We already have, Lily, I said. We already have. But as I sat down to prepare for the final day in court, I received a text from Taylor, the cousin who had provided the video. Sarah, be careful tomorrow. I heard Olivia and Richard talking at the house today. They aren't going to the hearing to settle. They have something else, something they say will end you for good. I looked at the phone, a cold knot forming in my stomach. What else could they have? They had already tried to take my daughter. They had tried to take my identity. I realized then that a wounded animal is most dangerous when it is cornered. My father and sister were cornered, and they were ready to bite. I called Marcus, but his line was busy. I called his cell, but it went straight to voicemail. I looked out the window at the dark street. A black SUV was idling at the curb, its headlights off. It was the same model as the one my sister drove. I grabbed Lily and moved away from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. The war wasn't over. It was just moving into the final, darkest phase. I checked the locks on the door and the windows. I checked the security camera feed on my tablet. The SUV stayed there, a silent, predatory shape in the darkness. I sat on the floor with Lily holding her close, waiting for the morning light. I knew that whatever happened in that courtroom tomorrow, I had to be ready for the truth to get even uglier. Because the Miller family didn't just steal money, they stole lives, and they weren't going to let me walk away with mine without a fight. As the hours ticked by toward dawn, the SUV finally pulled away, leaving nothing but the smell of exhaust and a lingering sense of dread. I looked at the results of the paternity test sitting on the table. The truth was there in 99.9% certainty, but I knew that in my father's world, the truth was just another thing to be manipulated. I stood up and straightened my suit, the one I would wear to face them one last time. I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't see the girl who had been shoved. I didn't see the woman who had run. I saw the one who was going to finish it. I walked out the door with Lily, my head held high, ready to walk into the lion's den. I didn't know what ending Olivia had planned for me, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the one who should be afraid. The morning air was a cold gray mist that clung to the windows of the courthouse. I stood on the sidewalk, my hand gripping Lily's, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on my shoulders. Marcus met us at the entrance, his briefcase looking like a shield. He didn't say much, just gave me a curt nod that told me he was ready for whatever ambush waited inside. The courtroom was packed. Relatives I hadn't seen in years sat in the back rows, whispering and leaning away as I walked past. They were like vultures waiting to see whose carcass would be left for the picking. At the front table, my father and Olivia sat shoulder to shoulder. Richard didn't look at me, but Olivia did. She gave me a slow, chilling smile that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the smile of someone who was losing. It was the smile of someone who had an ace up her sleeve. The judge entered, and the room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Marcus stood up, first laying out the final tally of the theft, the $380,000 in direct withdrawals, the $50,000 in diverted dividends, and the interest that had accrued over 7 years. The total was staggering, climbing towards $600,000. "Your Honor, Marcus," said his voice echoing with authority, "the evidence of fraud is absolute. The paternity test has confirmed the biological link. We are asking for full restitution and treble damages for the predatory nature of this breach." I watched the judge's pen move across his pad. It felt like we were seconds away from the finish line. But then my father's lead attorney stood up, his expression one of feigned regret. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "while we acknowledge the financial records, we have a discovery that supersedes the original trust documents. My clients have found a signed amendment to the trust dated 2 years before Arthur Miller passed away." My heart stopped. Marcus froze beside me. The attorney walked to the bench and handed a yellowed piece of paper to the judge. This amendment, witnessed and signed by the decedent, states that in the event Sarah Miller showed herself to be of unstable character or acted in a manner that brought public shame to the family name, her portion of the trust would be forfeited and transferred in its entirety to her sister Olivia. A collective gasp went up from the gallery. I felt the air leave my lungs. A forfeiture clause. It was the perfect trap. They had spent months trying to frame me as unstable, from the motel photos to the custody filing, just to trigger a fake document they had tucked away for this very moment. Olivia's smile widened. She looked at me as if I were already a ghost. The judge studied the paper for a long time, his face unreadable. Marcus leaned in, his voice a frantic whisper. "I need to see that document. Now." The judge allowed a 10-minute recess. Marcus practically snatched the paper from the bailiff's hand. He laid it out on the table, pulling a high-powered magnifying glass from his bag. He studied the signature, the ink, the texture of the page. My father and Olivia sat across the room looking like they were already planning their victory party. "Look at the date," Sarah Marcus whispered, his eyes narrowing. "June 14th, 2014. "What about it?" I asked, my voice trembling. He pointed to a tiny, microscopic watermark near the bottom edge of the paper, barely visible under the light. "This paper stock," Marcus said, his voice trembling with a different kind of energy. "This specific brand and weight of legal bond paper wasn't manufactured until 2018. Your grandfather died in 2016. I stared at the tiny mark. It was a mistake. A small, arrogant mistake born from the belief that they were smarter than the world. The judge called the court back to order. He looked at Marcus. "Mr. Marcus, does your client dispute the validity of this amendment?" Marcus stood up, and for the first time, he didn't just look like a lawyer, he looked like an executioner. "Your Honor, we don't just dispute it. We are requesting an immediate criminal referral for the forgery of a legal document. This paper was manufactured 2 years after the man who supposedly signed it was buried in the ground." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched my father's face. The purple rage I was so used to seeing turned into a sickly gray terror. He turned to Olivia, whose smile had vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, panicked realization. She had been the one to handle the records. She had been the one who thought a cheap laser printer and some old-looking paper could save them. The judge took the paper back, his eyes flashing with a cold, righteous anger. He looked at the forensic watermark through his own glass. Then he looked at Richard and Olivia. "This court is no longer just discussing a civil breach of trust," the judge said, his voice like a gavel strike. "This is a criminal conspiracy to defraud. Bailiffs secure those documents." He turned to me, and for the first time his expression softened. "Ms. Miller, this court finds in your favor on all counts. I am awarding you full restitution of the original trust, plus interest totaling $580,000. Furthermore, due to the malicious nature of the fraud and the attempted forgery, I am awarding treble damages. The total judgment against Richard Miller and Olivia Miller is $1,740,000. The gallery erupted. People were standing, shouting, and leaning over the railings. I sat there unable to move as the weight of 24 years of being less than finally lifted. My father tried to stand, but his legs seemed to give out. He slumped back into his chair, a broken man in an expensive suit. Olivia was sobbing, her head in her hands, realizing that not only was her lifestyle gone, but her freedom was now in the hands of the district attorney. Marcus leaned over and squeezed my hand. "It is over, Sarah. They can't hurt you anymore." As we walked out of the courtroom, my mother was standing in the hallway. She looked at me with eyes full of a desperate, pleading hope. "Hannah, honey, please. We didn't mean for it to go this far. Talk to the judge. Tell him we are a family." I stopped and looked at her. I thought about the 19-year-old girl who had begged for $40 for her sick child. I thought about the 9-year-old girl who had been shoved onto a hardwood floor while this woman watched. "You had 24 years to be a family," I said quietly. "You chose to be a bank instead. I hope the interest was worth it." We walked past her out of the courthouse and into the bright, biting winter sun. Lily was waiting in the lobby with Marcus's assistant. When she saw me, she ran toward me, her small arms wrapping around my waist. "Did we win, Mommy?" she asked, her voice clear and bright. "We won, Lily," I said, picking her up and holding her close. "We are going home." 4 months later, the restitution started coming in. To cover the $1 million judgment, my father was forced to liquidate legacy properties. The mansion was sold at auction, the gold-rimmed plates and the mahogany furniture hauled away in the back of moving trucks. Olivia had to declare bankruptcy, her cars and her jewelry seized to pay back the dividends she had knowingly stolen. They moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of town, living off the meager Social Security checks that my father had once mocked. No one called them. No one invited them to Christmas dinners. They were left with nothing but each other and the bitter memory of the legacy they had burned to the ground. I used a portion of the money to buy a small, sturdy cottage on the coast. It had a porch that looked out over the Atlantic and a backyard where Lily could run without fear. I set up a college fund for her, one that was locked tight with Marcus as the only trustee. I went back to school and finished my degree, no longer having to choose between a textbook and a grocery bill. The night after we moved into our new home, I sat on the porch and watched the moon rise over the water. The air was salty and sweet, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I realized then that the money wasn't the victory. The victory was the silence. The silence of a phone that didn't buzz with threats. The silence of a room where no one was being pushed. The silence of a life that finally belonged to me. My father had spent his whole life trying to prove I wasn't his, but in the end, he was the one who was disinherited. He lost his name, his home, and his daughters. He was a man who had everything and realized too late that he had nothing at all. I went inside and tucked Lily into her bed. She was surrounded by her dolls, a soft nightlight casting a warm glow over her face. She looked up at me and smiled the bruise on her knee from that Christmas night, now nothing more than a faint fading memory. "I love you, Mommy," she whispered. "I love you more than all the stars, Lily," I replied. As I walked out of her room and into my own life, I knew that the Miller story was finally over. But the story of Sarah and Lily, that was just beginning. Sitting here today reflecting on the path that brought me to this quiet porch by the sea, I'm reminded of a truth that many people spend their entire lives trying to outrun. We are told from a young age that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred circle that excuses any wound and forgives any betrayal. But the years have taught me that blood is merely a biological fact. It is not a moral contract. There is a profound danger in the kind of pride my father carried. He believed that because he provided the walls of a house, he owned the souls within it. He believed that money could buy silence and that power could rewrite the truth. But as we saw, a legacy built on the suffering of others is nothing more than a house of cards waiting for the wind to change. You cannot plant seeds of cruelty and expect to harvest a lifetime of loyalty. The most painful lesson I had to learn was that you cannot save people who are committed to their own greed. I spent so many years trying to earn a seat at a table that was never meant for me, thinking that if I were just a little quieter, a little more helpful, or a little more real, they would finally see me. But some people only see you as a tool or a threat. If you find yourself in a family that treats your existence like a debt you can never repay, please listen to me. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to build your own table. Integrity is a quiet thing. It doesn't need a mansion or a gold-rimmed plate to prove its worth. It lives in the way you treat those who can do nothing for you. It lives in the 4 words you speak when you finally decide that your child's safety is worth more than a hollow reputation. My father lost everything because he valued his image more than his soul. I gained everything because I chose to protect the only thing that actually mattered. To those of you listening to this story, I hope it serves as a reminder that the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how deep you bury it. Don't be afraid to stand up when the world tries to push you down. Your life is your own, and no one, not even those who gave it to you, has the right to steal your peace. If this story moved you or reminded you of the strength we all carry within us, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support allows me to keep sharing these lessons and stories of justice. Don't forget to like the video and leave a comment below. I read every single one, and I would love to hear your thoughts on what family truly means to you. Thank you for being part of this journey with me.